Welcome to our deep dive into Factfulness.
Yeah.
It's a book all about how to see the world more clearly.
Yeah.
We're diving into some excerpts that you picked out.
Right.
And our mission here is to kind of arm you with Rosling's fact-based framework for better understanding global trends.
Yeah, it's really about fighting that devastating global ignorance that Rosling talks about.
Exactly. And he starts by dropping this truth bomb on us right away.
Yeah.
That most people, even experts,
Yeah.
get basic facts about global trends wrong. He gave this global trends quiz to all sorts of folks, Nobel laureates, medical students, you name it. And get this, they scored worse than random chance.
Wow.
It makes you wonder what we really know about the world.
It's pretty humbling, isn't it? You'd think people that deal with global issues, would have a firmer grasp on the facts.
You would. But Rosling argues that it's not just about outdated knowledge. It's our worldview that's the problem.
Yeah.
He calls it the dramatic worldview. This tendency to oversimplify, to latch on to dramatic narratives,
Right.
and to miss the nuances.
It's like our brains are wired for drama, even when the reality is more complex.
Totally. And I love how he uses visuals to explain this.
Mm-hmm.
One of the biggest misconceptions is that outdated developed versus developing countries split. It totally ignores the massive group of people living in middle-income countries.
The ones that don't fit neatly into either box, so they just get overlooked. Rosling has this great analogy. Imagine like a child's drawing of a human, just a head and a body, no neck. That's how most people see the world. Just two extremes, missing all those crucial details in between.
Okay, that is a fantastic way to put it. So how do we fill in those missing details? Well, Rosling introduces this 4 levels framework. He says instead of these 2 categories, we need to think about 4 income levels.
Makes sense.
Right.
So level 1 is extreme poverty, like less than $2 a day. Rosling describes it as walking barefoot, fetching water from miles away, cooking over a fire. It's about survival.
Level 2, people have a bit more, maybe $4 a day. They can afford shoes, a bike, maybe even send one kid to school.
Yeah.
Then level 3 is about $16 a day. So think a fridge, a motorcycle.
Okay.
Kids are in school longer.
Gotcha.
And finally, level 4 is where most of us listening to this are, with over $32 a day.
Yeah, it's a much more nuanced picture than that old developed versus developing idea. It recognizes that billions of people have moved up these levels in recent decades. It challenges us to think, where am I on this scale, and what does that mean from my perspective?
That's such a crucial point. Our perspective is limited by our own experiences, right?
Sure.
But even if we get the 4 levels right, Rosling says we still have these ingrained dramatic instincts that distort our worldview.
Yeah, he lists 10 of them, these mental shortcuts that lead us astray. And that first one, the gap instinct, is that tendency to divide the world into 2 extremes. Rich and poor, good and bad, us and them.
And that ties directly back to the 4 levels, right? Because the gap instinct makes us miss those crucial in-between levels, where most of the world's population actually lives.
Exactly. It's like focusing on the bookends and ignoring the whole bookshelf. Rosling gives this fascinating example of child mortality rates. You might see a headline about, thousands of children dying every day and think, oh, that's terrible. The world's a mess.
Right, because the size instinct, another one of those dramatic instincts, makes us focus on the sheer number without context.
Exactly. But if you look at the rate of child mortality, the number of deaths per 1,000 live births, you'll see that it's drastically decreased over the past century. That doesn't diminish the tragedy of those deaths, but it gives you a more accurate understanding of the progress that's been made.
So it's not about ignoring the bad, but about seeing the good alongside it.
Precisely. It's about having a more balanced and fact-based view of the world.
Okay, so we've tackled the gap instinct and the size instinct. What other mental traps do we need to watch out for? I know Rosling talks about the
negativity instinct.
Oh.
It's that pull we have towards focusing on the bad news, even if it doesn't reflect the bigger picture. Think about it. When's the last time you shared a positive news story?
Oh, you are so right. Bad news just tends to grab our attention more. It's kind of like Rosling compares it to a miscalibrated GPS that only warns you about danger on the left, never on the right. You end up kind of veering way off course thinking the right side is always safe.
Yeah, it's a perfect analogy. It highlights how this instinct can lead to such a skewed perspective. We might think the world is constantly getting worse, when in reality it's improving in so many ways. Like Rosling points out that extreme poverty has been halved in the last 20 years. But how often do you hear that story on the news?
That's incredible. Yeah, it makes sense, though. We're just bombarded with negativity, and it makes it hard to see the progress that is happening. It's like that saying, if it bleeds, it leads.
Exactly. So how do we fight this instinct? Rosling suggests reminding ourselves of the progress that's been made, even while acknowledging the challenges that remain. It's about finding that balance.
He also talks about the straight line instinct, assuming that trends will just continue in a straight line, ignoring the possibility of curves and dips and changes in direction.
He gives the example of population growth. A lot of people assume it'll just keep skyrocketing, but Rosling shows how the data actually points to a leveling off. It's more like an S-curve than a straight line.
So we need to be aware of the different shapes that trends can take. Not everything follows a predictable path.
Right. And then there's the fear instinct, which can make us overestimate the likelihood of unlikely dangers. Think about how much media coverage is devoted to plane crashes or terrorist attacks. It makes us think those things are way more common than they actually are.
Yeah, which statistically are far less dangerous than things we do every day,
Right.
like driving a car.
Precisely. It's all about perspective. And that brings us to another fascinating one, the destiny instinct. This is the belief that certain countries or cultures are just destined to be a certain way, that things are fixed and can't change.
Like saying, oh, that country will always be poor because of its culture. Or that group will never be successful because of their history. It completely ignores the power of human agency and the fact that societies evolve.
Remember that child's drawing analogy? The destiny instinct keeps us stuck with that oversimplified view, refusing to acknowledge the possibility of change and progress. But we've seen countries defy their supposed destinies time and time again.
Like South Korea, which went from being one of the poorest countries in the world to a global economic powerhouse in just a few decades. Or think about how life expectancy has dramatically increased globally across all levels.
Absolutely. And it shows that progress is possible, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. But we can be blinded to that progress if we cling to these limiting beliefs about destiny. Now, how about we unpack the single perspective instinct?
Yes, this one really resonates with me. It's about getting stuck in one way of thinking, one solution, one ideology, without considering alternative perspectives or the complexity of a situation.
It's that classic hammer and nail problem. If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And this instinct can be especially dangerous when it comes to solving global problems.
Because there's rarely one right answer, right? There are multiple ways to approach a problem, and we need to be open to exploring all those different solutions.
Exactly. Rosling stresses the importance of seeking out diverse viewpoints, listening to people with different experiences and backgrounds. It's about recognizing that no one person or group has all the answers.
And this ties into the blame instinct, doesn't it? Because when we're stuck in a single perspective, it's easy to point fingers and find a scapegoat, instead of understanding the systemic causes of a problem.
Oh, it's so much easier to blame a particular politician or group for a complex issue like poverty or climate change. But that kind of simplistic thinking prevents us from seeing the bigger picture and finding effective solutions.
Instead of pointing fingers, we need to examine the systems and structures that contribute to these problems.
Yeah. Exactly. It's about looking beyond individual actors and understanding the underlying causes. Now, there's another instinct that often makes us jump to conclusions and act impulsively, the urgency instinct.
Oh, this one is a killer. It's that feeling of, we have to do something now. It makes us rush into decisions based on fear without properly considering the data or the long-term consequences.
Think about how we often react to a crisis. There's this immense pressure to act immediately, even if it means implementing a solution that's not well thought out, or might cause more harm in the long run.
It's like that saying, measure twice, cut once. But the urgency instinct makes us want to skip the measuring part entirely.
Exactly. So how do we combat this? Rosling says we need to take a breath, look at the data, consider the potential consequences, and resist the urge to make hasty decisions. It's about being thoughtful and strategic, even when facing urgent challenges.
It's about recognizing that sometimes the best action is to pause, gather more information, and then make a well-informed decision. He gives this great anecdote about his experience going to a remote village in Tanzania to study a disease called konzo.
Konzo.
Yeah, it's a paralyzing disease caused by eating improperly processed cassava. Anyway, Rosling and his team arrive, all set to collect blood samples and do their research, but they're met with hostility and suspicion. The villagers think they're there to harm them, maybe steal their blood or spread diseases.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it turns out a previous vaccination campaign had gone wrong, leading to this deep distrust of outsiders, especially doctors. A classic case of the blame instinct in action, right?
Absolutely. They were blaming the doctors for something that wasn't their fault, instead of understanding the complexities of the situation.
It could have turned violent. But Rosling took the time to listen to their fears, patiently explaining what they were doing and why. And he realized that he had to earn their trust before any real work could be done.
Hmm, what a powerful lesson in the importance of cultural context and building trust, especially when dealing with sensitive issues like health and disease.
Makes you wonder how many global efforts are hampered by similar misunderstandings. And it reminds us that data alone isn't enough. We need empathy and cultural awareness too.
Speaking of awareness, how did Rosling himself become so attuned to these instincts and their impact on our thinking?
Well, he admits he wasn't always this insightful. He thought he was objective and data-driven. But then he started noticing these patterns and how people, including himself, misinterpreted the world. It was a process of self-discovery, realizing he wasn't immune to these cognitive biases.
So it's not about being perfect, but about recognizing our own biases and actively working to overcome them.
Exactly. And he provides a ton of practical tips for doing just that. Like for the fear instinct, he suggests calculating the actual risks instead of relying on our gut feelings, which can often lead to these overblown fears. And for the destiny instinct, he encourages us to look for examples of change and progress, to remind ourselves that things aren't fixed.
It's about challenging our assumptions, seeking out information that contradicts our biases, and constantly updating our knowledge. The world is constantly evolving, and we need to evolve with it.
He even says knowledge has a sell-by date. We can't just rely on what we learned in school or from outdated media. We have to stay curious, seek out new information, and be open to changing our minds.
So lifelong learning is key. But what does Rosling ultimately want us to do with all this knowledge about factfulness?
His hope was for us to become more informed and engaged citizens, to make better decisions in our own lives, contribute to a better world, and share this fact-based worldview with others.
It's like he's saying now that you know better, do better. But it's not just about responsibility, it's about hope, too.
He truly believed that despite all the challenges, the world is getting better. And he wants us to embrace that hope, to use it as fuel for positive change.
It's data-driven optimism, a powerful antidote to all the doom and gloom we're constantly bombarded with.
I love that. So there you have it. That's your deep dive into factfulness. We hope you found it as eye-opening as we did. And remember, the world is more amazing than we tend to think. So keep learning, keep questioning, and keep working towards a brighter future.